In the span of a decade, Alexei Navalny went from being one of the Kremlin's biggest foes to Russia's most prominent political prisoner. And on Friday, news of his death sparked shock, outrage, and speculation.
Russian media say Alexei Navalny has died in prison.
A statement online said that Mr. Navalny had felt poorly after a walk and lost consciousness soon afterwards.
The fact that the main opposition leader is murdered in that, or dies in that, in those weeks before the election, really shows how confident and emboldened Putin is.
Navalny was one of the Kremlin's most vocal critics and a regular target of Russian authorities. Let's go through the key moments that cemented Navalny as the face of Russia's opposition and one of the most famous anti-corruption activists in the world. Alexei Navalny's story starts, at least in terms of him being perceived as a threat to Russia, during his time as a lawyer in the mid-2000s. He founds an anti-corruption foundation and makes a name for himself blogging about the excess wealth of Kremlin elites. Over time, he channels that work into political action, using his online platform to rally a protest movement ahead of Russia's 2011 election. His tagline at the time was, "Putin's party is one of crooks and thieves." Then, in 2013,
the prominent Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny has had his bid to become Moscow mayor accepted.
even though he's been barred from Russian radio and TV, and he's running against Putin's former chief of staff, Navalny still gets nearly a third of the vote in that election. From there, Navalny's influence only continues to grow.
Артем Чайка и его коллеги – это не имеет никакого отношения.
His anti-corruption foundation starts releasing long-form documentary-style videos, like this one, called Chaika, accusing then-Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika of corruption. And these videos rack up millions of views. Around this time, Navalny's under constant criminal investigation. To name just a few of the charges against him: embezzlement, fraud, corruption, which he says are all politically motivated. Eventually, he faces guilty verdicts and sentencing.
The plot line here is that any time Alexei Navalny garnered more support or too much of a profile, there would be some attempt to get him into court, to convict him on what many believe are trumped-up charges, and to put him in jail.
A few years later, as internet access starts to expand in Russia, Navalny takes advantage. He releases another documentary on YouTube, investigating what he calls the hidden wealth of then-Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev.
Заместитель председателя правления этого банка.
Essentially, he accuses Medvedev of embezzling around $1 billion.
The Kremlin controls all the media in Russia, particularly the broadcast media. So he was cutting through on the social media platforms and really got quite a following among young people in Russia who were in opposition to Putin's long regime.
Navalny then tries to run against Putin in Russia's 2018 election, but the Kremlin bars him from the ballot. And so he creates a kind of opposition network, launching coordinated rallies and campaign-style offices across the country, calling on his supporters to boycott the election entirely. But in the summer of 2020, things take a drastic turn. On a flight from Tomsk in central Russia to Moscow, Navalny gets really sick.
In a video recorded by fellow passengers, Alexei Navalny can be heard moaning in pain.
I get out of this bathroom, turn over to the flight attendant and said him, I was poisoned, I'm gonna die.
His plane makes an emergency landing. He's hospitalized, goes into a coma, and then a standoff begins. Initially, doctors in Russia don't let him leave. But then German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Navalny's wife put pressure on the Kremlin. And eventually, he's flown to Berlin for treatment. Within days, a stunning outcome.
Now the German government says it has proof beyond doubt that he was attacked with the chemical nerve agent Novichok.
Novichok is that military-grade nerve agent Russia used just 2 years earlier in the UK in another attempted assassination. So when the international community heard it was Novichok in Navalny's system,
most of the Western world then realized that the Russian regime was trying to kill Alexei Navalny by poisoning him.
Russian officials deny any involvement. And prosecutors refuse to open a criminal investigation. So over the next few months, while he's recovering in a secret location in Germany, Navalny takes matters into his own hands. With the help of investigative group Bellingcat, Navalny calls one of the Kremlin agents that he believes was involved in his poisoning, and he pretends to be an official in Russia's National Security Council, tasked with debriefing the operation. The agent then gives him a detailed account of what happened, and even talks about how the nerve agent was planted in his underwear. Navalny also publishes evidence that Russian operatives had been trailing his every move for years and were near him right around the time he was poisoned. Meanwhile, the Russian government makes it clear, if he comes back, he'll be arrested.
There was a lot of concern that should he go back to Russia, that he would be not only in prison, but perhaps put his life in danger again.
And yet, a couple of weeks later,
inside the plane that has just landed in Moscow carrying the Putin critic Alexei Navalny.
Millions of people are glued to live streams waiting for Navalny's return.
But as you can see there, for anybody tuning in, we are getting live pictures of the moment Alexei Navalny has stepped foot back onto Russian soil.
Just minutes after he gets off that plane, he's detained.
For what the Russian Federal Prison Service said were repeated violations of his probation.
He went back to Russia, he told a broadcaster, because if he didn't go back, he could never hold up to the promise that he ultimately someday might be able to run for office in Russia.
Navalny tells his supporters to take to the streets, saying, "This isn't just about me. This is about the future of Russia." And they do. Navalny's arrest turned him into an even more powerful figure in Russia and around the world.
He was seen as a kind of figurehead, showing that somebody was in fact standing up to Putin.
Coordinated protests continued across the country in support of Navalny, despite sometimes violent crackdowns by police. Meanwhile, his sentences just kept growing, like this one in August 2023. Then, in December, he disappears from the prison system entirely and turns up a couple weeks later in a prison colony above the Arctic Circle.
His new prison is roughly 3,200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, and it's known as the Polar Wolf. It's thought to be one of the toughest prisons in Russia.
But none of that stops him from continuing to criticize Putin and rally support against his government. After reports of his death started to surface, one of his closest allies, the chief of his anti-corruption foundation, said he believes it is highly likely Navalny had been killed and that a murder had actually happened.
It's not at all unusual for opponents and critics of Vladimir Putin, even those who simply carry out journalistic reporting, to end up dead.
Neither his death nor the cause of his death have yet been officially confirmed, but the news has certainly sent ripples across both Russia and the rest of the world.
For too long, too many hopes have actually been pinned on some kind of liberal democratic force within Russia changing the country from within. That hope has got to be diminished today.
Diminished hope. Just 1 month ahead of an election in which Putin has no significant opposition.